As we got closer to the selection of the college football playoff teams, the four that made it, obviously the Washington schedule became a high piece of conversation and of much scrutiny because of the lack of marquee teams on the non-conference slate. Of course, the Pac-12, a rather deep conference, maybe a little bit down this year. Looking at Washington's 2017 schedule with Jack Fullman from Pacific Takes. And Jack, I see right off the top, we've got that familiar game against Rutgers. So a trip out to the East Coast this time after the Huskies obviously had their way against what's probably the worst team. Yeah, definitely the worst team in the Big Ten.
They have the what do you call it? The home and home with Rutgers. They get the road trip this time, so I guess that might help the schedule a little bit as far as strength goes, but not really. I don't expect too much out of Rutgers next year, but you never know. Yeah, so non-conference wise, the Huskies most likely, if they can stay in that playoff conversation again, they're going to have to probably face questions about their non-conference schedule because they play Rutgers, Montana, and Fresno State. So, not much room for error outside of this year because of their weak non-conference schedule.
So, Jack, what I typically look at when I look at the schedule is obviously the non-conference. And we know that in the Pac-12, you play 9 games, so you only miss 2 opponents. You play the non-conference slate of 3 to start the season. That includes the 3 that you just mentioned. So probably nothing that's going to catch the committee's eye. If that becomes an issue, which it obviously did for a good reason, playing themselves in a position to get to the playoffs. Also, what comes into play is missing 2 teams within the conference. And for Washington this year, they don't see USC from the South. Arizona is probably going to be the worst team from the South, so they miss the Wildcats as well.
Yeah, missing USC, that's one thing that's going to probably hurt their strength of schedule. But the thing is, most likely, if the Huskies do win the North, all bets are on them meeting USC in the Pac-12 championship game. And for Pac-12 fans, that's a big game to keep an eye on, because if you look at those 2 teams' schedules, those 2 teams, it's hard to go 12-0, but I don't see a game on either of those 2 team schedules they won't be favored in. So you have a potential for an epic Pac-12 championship game. And even where if one of those teams loses a game along the way, and one goes undefeated, or they both lose one game, where there's a very good chance that that's a play-in game for the playoffs, depending on how things shake out. For both teams. So yeah, the Huskies, it's kind of a nice thing for them that most likely they miss USC, but if they get to the championship game, they get USC, and it'll give them a good chance to make a case for the playoffs if they're in position.
So where's that tough stretch? That's always another question as well. And for the Huskies, to me, it looks like they've got that bye week on October 21st, and then coming down the stretch, we know UCLA was way down last year at 2-7 in the conference. Should bounce back if Josh Rosen stays healthy. Oregon down last year again, but we would expect the Ducks to maybe possibly bounce back to a certain extent with Willie Taggart in place. Then it's Stanford on the road. It's Utah. It's Washington State before a potential Pac-12 championship game. So the bulk of the schedule, the meat of the schedule is actually at the tail end.
Yeah, I think the good thing for them is I think only one of those games is on the road. They have a crazy thing where after October 14th, they only leave Husky Stadium once, and that's at Stanford, which is probably the least hostile environment in the whole conference. Though Stanford will be a good team, that's a challenging game. That's not, a particularly tough road trip. Yeah, that's going to be their gauntlet, and I think for them, a lot of those teams have the potential to be pretty good, like a UCLA or an Oregon, but you really don't know, because both those are 2 programs that have talent but were train wrecks this year. And then you have a Utah team and a Washington State team that are kind of the opposite. They're the kind of the teams they get the most out of what they have, and they sneak up on teams. And so it's an interesting kind of way that plays out. If you kind of took what those teams had last year and what they have coming in next year, none of them look like they're the kind of teams that should be able to beat a top 10 team, but there's certainly going to be challenges, and that's kind of their path to getting back to the playoffs.
Yeah, for a conference that was challenging the SEC, at least in perception, as being possibly the top conference in America just a few years ago, it's really flattened out. So besides Washington and USC rising to the top, It's, again, a very deep conference. There are no jokes in the conference for the most part. Not even Oregon State at this point, as they rose up the rankings. It's a balanced conference, but it's not necessarily an elite conference. And I'm going to be interested to see what the Pac-12 does. And they need the likes of UCLA and Oregon to get back into the fray, as well as obviously Colorado, in addition to Washington State playing much better football this past season. So Jack Fullman from Pacific Takes looking at the Washington 2017 schedule. Thanks a lot, Jack.
Thanks, Mark.